Hey, thanks for checking out Nuts and Bolts with Tone, and welcome to my channel. Today we're going to talk about AC service on hybrid vehicles. So let's talk about what makes it an actual hybrid, because I've had guys in the shop that I try to help out, and they're not sure whether it's a hybrid or not because the vehicle's a hybrid. So you would think it's a hybrid, a hybrid vehicle. So the way you can differentiate between this is several ways. One, if the AC compressor is driven by a belt, then that is not a true hybrid AC system. It is a belt-driven AC system on a hybrid vehicle. So I've seen some Fords like this. Toyotas aren't like this. The original, the first version of the Prius, or I think it was what was it? It was like a Toyota. It was a little tiny Toyota car, and it was a hybrid, but the AC system was belt driven. So that one does not apply. What we're talking about is where the AC system is driven by the hybrid system, and the way you can check by that is one, the main way you can tell is you'll have big orange cables going to the AC compressor because it's powered by the hybrid system, not by a belt. Not by the car's, the traditional AC system. So that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about hybrid AC systems, and we're going to talk about what you should and shouldn't do. So first, let me explain something about what is the premise for this video. So I've been going to classes for a really long time, and I would sit in class, and let me say, I've been in a lot of classes where they tell you something, make sure that you do this, make sure you don't do that, okay? And a lot of times it applies to some, but doesn't apply to all, or I found it to not be true. But one thing is for certain, I've been told since day one on hybrid vehicles that you cannot just hook up an AC machine to the hybrid, to the vehicle without flushing the hoses. And the reasoning behind that is that hybrid AC systems, they use a different kind of AC oil. And that oil is non-conducive. So what it was described to me is if you were, let's say you had a machine and you hooked up to a Ford Focus, and then you went straight to a Prius and you serviced it. Well, you still have oil in the lines, in the hoses. And what happens is that Freon's going to take that oil and it's going to put it into the car. And basically inside the compressor, you have, it spins around, all right? And if you have any sort of regular AC oil in there, it's conducive. And what it does is it starts conducting electricity. And the ground is the case. So it starts to slowly ground itself out inside, and it will fail. And what I was told was that if you do this, you will destroy the AC system, and every single thing on the AC system has to be replaced. All the lines, compressor dash has to come out, the evap core, every single AC component has to be replaced. Now, you wonder, how relevant is this? Is it relevant? Yes, it is, absolutely. So I was at another shop and I was working there, and we had multiple locations, and at one of the locations, somebody had serviced a Prius and they didn't flush the hoses. And then very shortly after, the AC system failed. And it had to go to the other shop, to one of the other shops, to have the entire AC system replaced. Dash out, lines, everything. It was very expensive. I mean, you're talking about, I don't know, I think in the class they were talking about $6,000, $7,000, $8,000 to replace an entire AC system on a hybrid, on a Prius. So that absolutely does happen. It can happen, and it will happen. And I was told that in the early days of the hybrids, what was really common was that the body shops didn't have, now this is speculation, that the body shops didn't have a machine that serviced hybrids. And so they would just charge up the system, and then eventually it would fail. And so you gotta make sure that you can service this. So I'm gonna show you a little clip right now of what it looks like when your machine is capable of servicing hybrids. All right, so before you decide that you're going to service a hybrid cooling system, and I'll explain what an actual hybrid cooling AC system is you want to make sure that your machine is capable of servicing hybrids. And the way you're going to do that is by here. We're going to go here, and we're going to hit next. And you see right there how it says hose flush. Okay, you have to have that function. If you don't have that function, you cannot service a hybrid AC system. I'll explain what that does and why, but if you do not, you should have a hose flush system. And the way that you do it is you turn on the machine and you're gonna hook up your AC ports to your fittings on your machine. In this case, it's these, and you're gonna hit hose flush, and it takes about 10 minutes, and it removes all the existing oil from the lines and the connections at the end of any regular oil. Okay, so you have to make sure that it has the hose flush function. Now, you won't be able to inject oil. Now, I believe there's some machines that can do multiple different kinds of oil. I'm not sure. I've never been in a shop that had the capability of injecting oil into the vehicle of a hybrid. So basically, you're just servicing the AC system. Now, the first thing that you want to check for, I'm going to show you right now, is you want to look at the AC Schrader ports. All right, so while you're servicing a hybrid AC system, the main thing, well, not the main thing, but a really, really important thing, I'll talk about it in a little bit, is that when you look at these Schraders, when you take the caps off, that you look before you hook up your AC machine, that you don't see any signs of dye, any signs of oil or dye. You should see no oil or dye in here, because you can't use regular AC oil and dye in a hybrid. But the first thing that you do before you ever hook up your AC machine is you make sure you don't see green dye. You don't need to get your dye light. You'll know if there's dye there. Okay, so when you're looking at those ports that I just showed you, you could see that there's no signs of green at all whatsoever in those ports. And that means that there's been no oil or dye. So like, we use AC oil that has dye in it. Some shops use regular oil and then just straight up dye. There's lots of different ways you can do it. There's canisters you can put on the hoses. There's a caulking type gun that will just inject oil in the AC system, or your machine will do it for you. So our machine will inject oil and dye, or both. And so the first thing I always do before I hook up to a hybrid is I make sure that there's no signs of green on the Schrader ports, because if there was, then I probably wouldn't touch it. We would probably let the office know, because this AC system is going to fail and there's no way around it. And we wouldn't want to eat that. And so the best thing to do would be to wash your hands of it and let it go somewhere else, because you're going to end up paying for it. So, and there's nothing you can say or do after the fact. You own it at that point. So make sure that you check that. Make sure you do your due diligence and check that, so you don't have to eat that AC system and also have a very unhappy customer, which in turn goes online and makes a complaint, and then it just turns into this big snowball. So you want to make sure that you are checking that before you hook up. So first thing, turn the machine on, pop the caps, look for green. And like I said, you don't need a dye light. You can see AC dye with a flashlight if it's in a Schrader port. And so as long as you don't see green, hook up your machine. Or before you hook up the machine, put your hoses on there and hit hose flush. It takes about 10 minutes. Then you can hook up. Now here's the kicker. You got to be careful of this. Let's say you go and you do an AC service and it needs AC component. Well, now you take the machine off, you're busy doing stuff, whatever, you don't really think about it. Maybe somebody come and grab that machine. We've got multiple machines, so you could get around that. But let's say somebody took that machine and you didn't know it, and then you hook up to the car, and then now you've just destroyed the AC system because you didn't know. So every single time before you hook up to a hybrid, make sure you flush the hoses. It is very important. You don't want to mess that up, and because that right there is just going to bite you. Now, that is hybrid AC warning. Now, I want to give you guys some tech tips on AC, and think about this when you're doing it. So In normal weather, 70, 80 degree ambient temperature, not super humid outside, really good, normal, perfect operating conditions of an AC system, whether it be a hybrid or a regular vehicle, if it's operating properly, is going to be 150 pounds on the high side and 30 on the low side. Those are good, those are great numbers. Now, some things that can change. So let's say you hook up to a vehicle and you're testing and the low side is a little low. Let's say the low side continues to drop and continues to drop. Let's say it goes into a vacuum, right? So if that ever happens and you're testing the AC and the low side drops into a vacuum, you've got an expansion valve that's stuck. Okay, so make sure you replace that expansion valve. That's going to be your cause there, and that's what's going to cause that AC low side dropping into a vacuum. Now, let's go to the high side. Now, the number one thing, so you got to remember vehicles. Let's say you have all different kinds of vehicles. Some vehicles have just straight up electric fans. Maybe they have one fan, maybe they have two. Maybe they have one fan and it's a multi-speed fan. So you take a PT Cruiser, a Dodge truck. They have one fan and that fan operates and it has a high and a low speed on the fan. So therefore you're gonna have a high speed relay and a low speed relay, and most of the time you can bidirectional control it with a scan tool. You can go in, command the low side. If the fan works great, just make sure you note the airflow, because sometimes I've seen where it will operate on low in both speeds, but it's because the high side failed or whatever. So then you go to the high side, you operate the high side, and you got to make sure that it turns on high and it should be blowing more air than the low side. And let's say it doesn't work. Okay, cool. Well, now you know you can go test your signals, and then you got to go back to your wiring diagram to verify if you've got power and ground, and then you're looking for whether it's a duty cycle fan or whether it has 3 wires and it has power on one wire for low, power on another wire for high, and then it's got ground. So you just got to make sure that you look up the wiring diagram. Now you want to make sure that you understand how that system works. Don't ever take for granted that an AC system with an electric, that a vehicle with an electric fan always works the same, because they don't always work the same and they don't always turn on at the same speeds. Some people think that if you turn on the AC, the fan should be on high. Well, that's not the case all the time. Sometimes the fan will be on low until the temperature of the coolant reaches a certain temperature, then it goes into high. So it's not going to make the fan work hard if it doesn't have to work hard, because then you just cool off the vehicle when it doesn't need to be cooled off. So make sure you remember that the differentiation between high and low, when it's supposed to get which speed. My rule of thumb is about 221. 221 is usually about where a cooling system will operate. In general, 221 is my generic number. If I don't have a spec, I kind of go off of that. Sometimes it's a little bit lower, sometimes it's a little bit higher, but always look it up. But that's about where your cooling system is going to operate, and it's gonna, it's gonna fluctuate from there. Now, the other thing that you got to be careful of is if you've got a fan clutch. Some vehicles have only a fan clutch. So that fan clutch is not going to pull as much air unless the vehicle is at full operating temperature. So it's at full operating temperature, that fan should be locked up solid. Turn the vehicle off, that fan should stop with the engine. I mean, it should be like, it shouldn't spin. Now, let's say it's at full operating temperature and you turn it off and the cooling fan and the fan keeps spinning, okay, your fan clutch has failed. Now, what you're gonna see with that is you're gonna see that your AC high side pressure is going to be too high. Generally, it'll just be too high, and it will slowly just go higher and higher and higher until eventually it cuts off. Usually what will happen with that is you'll be checking your temperature out of the vents, and it'll be, let's say it's 38 degrees, and then as the high side starts getting higher and higher and higher, you'll notice that at about 350 pounds on the high side, your cooling system will be at like 60 degrees. It won't be cooling anymore because the high side's too high. So remember that, check your fan clutch, check your electric fan, and always, now this goes with everything more than just fans. Always look at the description and operation of something. and when and why and how it's supposed to work and when it's tested. So like I said, if you turn on a vehicle, you turn the AC on, you assume the fan's going to be on high speed. If it's not supposed to be on high speed, you don't have a bad fan necessarily. It's just not being commanded on. So you got to be aware of that. Make sure you check that. And also condensers can plug. Now a lot of people have a problem with they see high side pressure and they automatically want to go after the condenser. If you don't have proper airflow through the condenser, your AC system will not work. So now here is an example of that. And don't let this bite you in the butt. It bit me in the butt one time, only once. If you get a whole bunch of road debris, grime, dirt, pine needles, a bag, anything that's in between the radiator and the condenser, it's not going to pull air through the condenser. So therefore it's not going to cool off the condenser. It's not going to drop the high side pressure. And then you're going to have a problem. I just had a Subaru last week that did the same thing. It had high side pressure. I suspected the condenser was plugged, but I pulled the radiator back, and sure enough, half the radiator was completely plugged with this thick of just debris. And then of course I cleaned it all out, I sprayed it all out, and the high side was still too high. So it had a bad condenser. But it was, it plugged up, and it also had an airflow issue. So always make sure you check that. Those are my tech tips for testing AC, and also how you test a hybrid AC system. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope it was informative for you. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and hit that bell. You get notified of all my future content. Also follow me on Instagram. I post daily stuff like this, little screenshots of the gauges, tools, all different kinds of stuff. So follow me there. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.